Artemis Pyle, the drummer for Lynyrd Skynyrd, will never forget that October night. The band had been touring nonstop, and everyone was looking forward to getting some rest after the show. They boarded their small chartered plane, a Convair CV-240, that would take them to Baton Rouge for their next gig. Pyle sat with his bandmates, joking and laughing, unaware that soon they'd be facing the unthinkable. Mid-flight, something went wrong. The engines began sputtering. A strange vibration ran through the aircraft, and the lights flickered. The pilots looked panicked, struggling with the controls as the plane started to descend. Everyone on board felt a chill as the realization hit. There was no way out of this. The descent became steeper, and Pyle could feel the terror building among his friends as the trees below rushed up to meet them. When the plane struck the dense Mississippi swamp, the impact was horrific. The metal twisted and crunched, seats ripped from their bolts, bodies thrown violently against walls and each other. Pyle was tossed forward, pain shooting through his body as he tried to brace himself. The noise was deafening, screams mixing with the groan of metal and the shattering of glass. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, everything went silent. Pyle struggled to move, his head pounding and his body bruised and battered. As he took in the scene around him, he realized the devastation. Bodies lay crumpled, some motionless, others groaning weakly. Blood was everywhere, the swamp illuminated by the faint, broken lights of the plane's remains. A fire was starting to catch on one side of the wreckage, and the smell of smoke filled the air. Pyle knew he had to move, that he had to find help if they were going to survive. Stumbling through the wreckage, he climbed out, his vision blurred and his body aching. He limped through the swamp, his mind fixated on finding help. Darkness swallowed him as he pushed through the trees, vines and branches snagging his clothes and scratching his skin. The blood from his wounds dripped steadily, painting his path through the dense foliage. After what felt like hours, he finally saw the faint glow of a farmhouse in the distance. Relief flooded him. He'd found a way out. He staggered up the hill, his voice hoarse as he called out for help. But in his state, he didn't notice that he must have looked like something from a nightmare. A tall, bloody, long-haired figure limping out of the darkness. The farmhouse door creaked open, and he saw the figure of a man standing there, silhouetted by the warm glow of the light inside. Before Pyle could explain, the homeowner, panicked and unprepared for the bloodied stranger in his yard, raised a shotgun. Pyle barely registered what was happening before he felt the sharp sting as the man pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the night, and Pyle felt himself stumble backward, his legs searing with pain. He managed to shout out, "Plane crash! Help!" And the homeowner, realizing what had happened, rushed to his side, wide-eyed and horrified. The man called for help immediately, and soon an ambulance was on its way. The chaos of that night would stay with Pyle forever. But despite it all, he made a full recovery, a miracle after everything he'd endured. The story of that crash and Pyle's unimaginable escape would later be etched into rock history, a tale of survival against impossible odds. My mom's friend, Linda, had been living alone for years in her little one-story house on the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it was cozy, the kind of place with creaky floors, wallpaper faded from the sun, and shelves lined with old photos. She liked her routines. Wake up early, go to work, make herself a simple dinner, and then curl up with a book or a movie. Quiet, predictable. But one day, Linda started noticing odd little things that made her wonder if she was losing her mind. It started small. She'd make a pot of soup, expecting it to last the week, but by Wednesday it was nearly gone. Or she'd buy a dozen eggs and find only half a dozen left the next day. Linda chalked it up to a bad memory, figuring she must have been using more than she thought. But then stranger things started happening. She'd find damp towels tossed in the laundry bin when she hadn't showered, or dishes in the dishwasher she didn't remember using. At first, she tried to brush it off, making excuses. Maybe she'd just forgotten, or maybe she'd been more tired than usual. Months passed, and these little oddities became her new normal. Still, the nagging feeling lingered in the back of her mind. She double-checked locks, and sometimes she even left a light on in the kitchen, hoping it'd scare away whatever was haunting her thoughts. One night, as she was lying in bed, she heard a faint thumping sound. It was so quiet that she thought it might just be the house settling, but the noise continued, growing louder, like something or someone was moving just above her. Linda's stomach twisted. She grabbed a flashlight and a small broom from the corner of her room, and with her heart pounding, she climbed up the narrow ladder to her attic. The air grew colder as she reached the top, and with each step, the thumping noise grew louder. At the top, Linda shone the flashlight around, and her blood ran cold. Amidst her old boxes and holiday decorations was a small setup that definitely didn't belong to her. There was a dusty old sleeping bag, a little pillow with her spare blanket, and beside it, a small portable hot plate, some empty cans, and crumpled food wrappers scattered around. Her hands shook as she took it all in, realizing someone had been living up there, right above her for who knew how long. Linda's first instinct was to run, but instead she backed slowly down the ladder, crept outside, and called the police. 2 officers came by and quietly swept the house, waiting with her until dawn. They didn't find anyone that night, but they told her they'd keep an eye on the house and patrol the area for a while. Linda barely slept, her mind racing with what-ifs. She couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been living in her attic might come back, might still be watching her even now. Over the next few days, Linda barely dared to go near the attic, jumping at every creak and noise. One evening, just after sunset, she noticed a shadow moving outside. She peered out the window and caught a glimpse of a figure climbing up a tree, disappearing into the thick branches that reached out towards the attic window. Her hands trembled as she watched, her mind racing. She called the police again, her voice barely a whisper, explaining what she'd seen. The officers arrived quickly, sneaking up to the house with flashlights and radios at the ready. They quietly surrounded the tree and waited. Moments later, they saw a man climbing down from the attic window. He was thin and ragged, his clothes worn and dirty, and when he saw the officers, he froze. He didn't try to run, didn't put up a fight, just stood there with a defeated look on his face, as if he knew his strange, secret life had finally come to an end. Linda watched from the porch as the officers questioned him, piecing together his story. His name was Henry. He'd fallen on hard times, lost his job, and had nowhere else to go. One night he'd found Linda's house, noticed the attic window left slightly open, and he'd climbed inside. From then on, he'd been living quietly above her, slipping down to the kitchen when she was at work to grab a bite to eat, using her bathroom when he needed to, but always careful to put everything back as he'd found it. Linda was horrified and fascinated, struggling to wrap her mind around it all. Part of her felt violated, her sense of safety shattered, but another part of her felt a strange sympathy for him. As she stood there, looking at him standing by the police car, she felt a strange calm come over her. After a long conversation with the officers, she made a surprising decision. Instead of pressing charges, Linda offered Henry a place to stay, on the condition that he help out around the house and look for a job. She felt uneasy at first, but over time she began to feel comfortable with Henry around. He was polite, respectful, and grateful for her kindness, always keeping to himself but helping out however he could. The 2 of them formed an odd friendship, sharing meals and exchanging stories. Slowly, Henry began to rebuild his life. Linda no longer felt like she was living alone, and over time, the eerie memory of those strange nights faded away. When my aunt was around 16, she was just starting out with a part-time job at a small grocery store. It was her first job, and she was eager to make a good impression, hoping that this would be her step into the adult world. Her boss was a guy in his mid-20s, probably not much more than 10 years older than her, but he always seemed to linger a bit too long, his compliments laced with a strange intensity. My aunt figured it was just the way he was. He hadn't crossed any serious boundaries, at least not yet. She'd brush off his excessive friendliness, convincing herself that he was just trying to be nice, maybe help her along in her job. One evening, our phone rang. My aunt was lounging around, flipping through a magazine, when I answered. "It's your boss," I said, handing her the phone. My aunt's face twisted a little, surprised to be hearing from him after work hours. She picked up the phone with a half-hearted smile, but her expression faded quickly as she listened to his voice on the other end. "I just wanted to see if you wanted to go out," he said, his voice eager, almost pleading. "Come on, sneak out, it'll be fun. I promise." My aunt was unsure. She glanced over at my mom, her younger sister, who was lounging beside her. It wasn't the first time her boss had hinted at hanging out after hours, and he sounded insistent tonight, pressing her to meet him. It put her in an awkward position. He was her boss, after all, and she didn't want to make him mad by saying no. She hesitated, glancing at the clock, considering it. But my mom's face went still. She had this uncanny sixth sense, a gut instinct that had saved her a time or two, and that night she felt it stronger than ever. Without hesitation, she grabbed my aunt's arm. "Don't go," she whispered. There was no room for argument in her voice. "Don't go with him tonight, please." My aunt was torn. She didn't want to upset her boss, but my mom's expression was like stone, her eyes wide with a seriousness that left no room for doubt. There was something in her voice, a sharp urgency that struck a chill down my aunt's spine. She finally told him no, her voice soft but firm. The refusal didn't go down well. Her boss's voice hardened, his tone growing hostile and annoyed. But even as he tried to coax her one last time, my mom's steady gaze convinced her to hang up. After a tense pause, she did. When the line clicked, they were left in silence, a strange, lingering tension in the air. My aunt tried to shrug it off, not wanting to believe that anything could really have happened. They sat up that night, restless, the unease fading only when dawn finally broke through the window. That morning, things took a dark, horrifying turn. Later, they found out that he had gone out that night anyway and met another girl instead. They didn't know all the details immediately, but eventually, the terrible truth unfolded. He'd driven her out to a secluded area, a place known for its towering cliffs. It was a spot where teens sometimes went to feel a thrill, but under his influence it became something twisted. He assaulted her, trapping her in a nightmare that no one could have foreseen. And when she was left broken and terrified, clinging to any hope of escape, he pushed her off the cliff. Miraculously, she survived. No one could believe it, not the paramedics, the doctors, or even the police. She was found alive, though gravely injured, her spirit just as strong as her body was shattered. Despite her horrific injuries, she remembered everything. The man, his face, his voice, and she told the authorities exactly who had done it. It wasn't long before they tracked him down, arresting him and charging him for what he'd done. He was soon convicted, and the story shook the town to its core. People could hardly believe that the friendly, smiling young man from the grocery store could be capable of something so unspeakably violent. And in those early days, when they were still reeling from the shock, my aunt and my mom sat together, reliving the previous night in their minds, a nauseating realization settling in. In the years that followed, the story became a haunting memory, a tale my family retold in low voices with a shudder. The girl who'd survived recovered, though she bore scars that went far beyond the physical. My aunt, meanwhile, was forever grateful that my mom had stopped her, that she had listened to the inexplicable instinct that had told her to stay home. My mom didn't talk much about that night, but when she did, she'd just shake her head with a haunted look. "Always trust your gut," she'd say softly, and my aunt, a little older, a little wiser, would nod, her hands sometimes trembling as she thought about what could have been. The Neuschaber train disaster is something that feels like it comes out of a nightmare, a story of unstoppable destruction that took hundreds of lives and turned entire towns into nothing but rubble. It was a chilly February morning in 2004 when it all began, a day that started out uneventfully before being twisted into horror. A train carrying 51 freight cars sat idly in the rail yard in the town of Khayyam, Iran. The cargo was a dangerous mixture: sulfur, fertilizer, gasoline, and cotton wool. Nothing was wrong, at least not yet, but all it took was one chain reaction, one thing set into motion, to turn the peaceful dawn into a scene straight out of an apocalyptic vision. In the early hours, while most of the town was still asleep, the train cars suddenly broke loose from the station. No one knows for sure how it happened. Some say it was due to a minor earth tremor. Others blame mechanical failure or poor handling. Whatever it was, the cars began to roll, picking up speed as they barreled down the tracks, completely unmanned. One by one, they rattled and clanged together, their momentum building as the weight of the deadly materials they carried drove them faster and faster. For 20 kilometers, the runaway train roared through the countryside, a ticking time bomb with no conductor and no brakes. In Khayyam, the first residents who noticed it reported a deep, ominous rumbling in the distance. A few people ventured out, squinting through the early light to see what was coming down the tracks. And then, with a horrible screech of metal against metal, the train finally derailed. The crash was catastrophic. Cars piled into each other like dominoes, each one carrying enough dangerous chemicals to level a building. As they ruptured, fires ignited almost instantly. Flames shot up, reaching toward the sky, fueled by the gasoline and sulfur, which spewed clouds of toxic smoke across the town. By now, people were running out of their homes, gasping as the smoke filled the air, choking and blinding them. Panic set in as the townspeople realized that they were dealing with something much worse than an ordinary derailment. Firefighters and emergency responders rushed to the scene, doing their best to contain the disaster. But it was already out of their hands. The fires blazed hotter and hotter, growing more intense as the chemicals continued to react with each other, creating an increasingly volatile situation. And then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, it happened. The explosion that followed was like nothing anyone could have imagined. One moment, the fires were raging. The next, there was a blinding flash and an ear-splitting roar as the entire cargo erupted. The shockwave tore through Khayyam, reducing buildings to splinters and tossing debris miles into the air. Witnesses said it was like the sun had exploded on the ground, sending a searing heat that blasted through anything and everything. The impact was so intense that it registered as a 3.6 magnitude earthquake, rattling windows and knocking objects off shelves in towns as far as 70 kilometers away. The devastation was beyond comprehension. Khayyam was obliterated, nothing left but ash and fragments of what had once been homes, shops, schools, and lives. The blast didn't stop there either. It reached 3 nearby towns, ripping through buildings, smashing windows, and leaving trails of destruction that stretched for miles. The people in these towns were flung to the ground by the force of the shockwave, their ears ringing as the walls around them cracked and crumbled. Those who survived the blast found themselves in a hellish landscape, trapped in what looked like the aftermath of a nuclear bomb. For days, the explosions continued as the chemicals in the wreckage reacted and ignited. Every few hours, another explosion would shake the ground, reminding the survivors of the horror they had just lived through. Rescue teams couldn't get close enough to search for bodies because the site was too dangerous. The smoke alone was thick with toxic fumes, poisoning the air for miles. The ground was scorched, littered with debris that still glowed with heat days after the initial explosion. In total, about 300 people lost their lives that day, and hundreds more were injured, many of them left scarred by burns and cuts from flying debris. Families searched for missing loved ones, combing through the wreckage only to find fragments of what had been homes and lives. The survivors would later say that it was as though death had come from nowhere, unleashed by a force that seemed almost supernatural in its scale and brutality. The Nishapur disaster remains a haunting memory, a reminder of how, in one instant, life can be torn apart by forces too large and uncontrollable to comprehend. It wasn't a battle, a war, or a storm. It was just a train, loaded with everyday materials, rolling down a track with no one on board, no destination, and no way to stop. But the destruction it left behind was as devastating as any of those things, and the memory of that day lingers as a terrifying reminder of how fragile life can be. My dad never talked much about his time in Vietnam, but a few weeks before he died, he told me a story from his time in the jungle that left me chilled and thinking for days. His voice took on a different tone when he told it, and he made sure I understood he'd only told it once before, to his grandmother on her deathbed many years earlier. It was the late 1960s, somewhere deep in the Vietnamese jungle. He was part of a small team assigned a quiet, isolated mission to lay seismic sensors along a series of trails used by the North Vietnamese army. The team consisted of 2 Americans, my dad and his buddy, along with 5 CIDG strikers, South Vietnamese villagers who'd been trained to fight with them. They moved in silence, each step muffled by the dense, humid air and thick underbrush. After 2 days trekking through tangled jungle, the group split up to cover more ground. My dad and 2 of the strikers veered off to stake out a trail intersection that intelligence had identified as a potential hotspot. They'd been lying in wait for hours in the underbrush, listening to the endless drone of insects, birds, and the occasional distant monkey call. Nothing unusual had happened, and with dusk beginning to settle in, they were deciding whether to move further down the trail or regroup with the others. Just before they stepped out from the thick cover of the jungle to cross the trail, my dad froze, his instincts screaming at him to check his surroundings one last time. The thick silence of the jungle pressed in around him as he scanned the intersection, his eyes moving slowly, methodically until they stopped on a figure lying along the trail just shy of the intersection. My dad squinted, his brain struggling to process what he was seeing. The figure was a Union soldier, his skin a light brown, dressed in full cavalry gear, uniform stained with age and wear but unmistakable. He wore 2 old pistols strapped to his belt, a worn Spencer rifle slung over his shoulder, and a short, curved club hung from his hip. The man's face was calm, his expression focused as if he too was watching the trail. Then suddenly, the soldier turned his head and locked eyes with my dad. My dad's breath caught. He couldn't move, couldn't blink. The Union soldier's gaze held steady, intense yet calm, like he knew exactly who he was looking at. Then, with a faint smile, the soldier slowly raised a finger to his lips, a silent command to stay quiet, before motioning for my dad to retreat back into the jungle. Still in a daze, my dad signaled to his 2 men to remain hidden and followed the Union soldier's gesture, retreating silently into the dense foliage. The soldier on the opposite side of the trail did the same, slipping back into the shadows as though he'd never been there at all. No sooner had my dad melted back into the cover of the jungle than he heard a faint rustling and snapping of twigs. Footsteps. He held his breath as the lead elements of a large group of North Vietnamese soldiers emerged onto the trail, passing just feet away from where he'd been standing moments earlier. The line of soldiers was long. He counted at least 70 or 80 men, all armed to the teeth with automatic rifles, light machine guns, and RPGs. They moved in silence, deadly and purposeful, in a line that seemed to stretch on forever. My dad lay frozen, every instinct telling him that a single misstep, one sound, would have his team discovered, and they'd be mowed down instantly by the sheer number of enemy soldiers. It took nearly 5 minutes for the column to fully pass by, and all the while his heart pounded in his chest, and yet his mind remained sharp, his focus unbreakable. Finally, when the last soldier had moved out of sight down the trail, my dad motioned to his men, and they began to pull back, slipping through the jungle as quietly as they could manage. They put distance between themselves and the trail as quickly as possible, taking every precaution to avoid being seen or heard. When they finally met back up with the main patrol, my dad reported the enemy soldiers they'd encountered, but he didn't say a word about the Union soldier he'd seen lying on the trail. For years, he kept that part of the story to himself, replaying it in his mind, but never speaking of it. He'd seen something impossible, something he couldn't explain, and he knew that telling anyone else would only make him sound crazy. But decades later, on her deathbed, he finally told his grandmother. Her reaction was not what he expected. She smiled, her eyes closed, as though she'd known all along, and she said softly, "You saw old Red Tom." Red Tom was my dad's great-great-grandfather, a man who had become a legend in the family. He'd been half black, half Creek, a free man, a skilled scout who'd fought for the Union during the Civil War, then later joined the U.S. Cavalry in the American West. Known for his uncanny ability to navigate hostile territory and disappear into the landscape, he carried 2 pistols, a Spencer rifle, and a Creek war club, just like the soldier my dad had seen that day. To this day, I can't shake the image of my dad lying silently in the jungle, staring into the face of a long-dead ancestor who may have saved his life. Whether it was a hallucination brought on by the stress of combat or something far stranger, he never forgot that moment, and neither will I. My friend's boss had always been a bit of a show-off, and he'd finally gotten his hands on an Audi A4 convertible back when they were new and turning heads. He loved that car more than anything and would talk about it endlessly at work, showing off every sleek feature and detail to anyone who'd listen. One of the standout features was the pop-up roll hoops, hidden until a rollover triggered them, meant to save your life in case you lost control. He often joked about how he'd probably never need them, but he'd also remind people just how well protected he'd be if anything ever happened. One weekend, he was driving down a quiet, winding stretch of road in the mountains, the kind that's exhilarating in a powerful car but demands total attention. He'd been driving it many times before, but this time he was pushing the car a little too hard. He came around a tight corner and felt his grip on the wheel slip, the tires skidding, not catching the road fast enough. Suddenly, the car was out of control and there was nothing he could do to pull it back. He felt the car lurch, then tip as it skidded over the edge of the road. Everything happened in a flash, but he was aware of every terrifying second. The car plummeted down a steep embankment, the sound of crunching metal and breaking glass filling the air. Then, with a hard jolt, the roll hoops popped up from behind him, cushioning the impact as the car hit the ground below, landing upright in a thick patch of bushes and trees. Dazed, he blinked a few times, his mind struggling to catch up to the situation. Cuts and scratches stung his face and arms from the bushes he'd crashed through, but he was alive. Stumbling out of the car, he looked around, his head swimming as he realized he'd survived what could have easily been a fatal accident. He climbed up the embankment slowly, gripping onto roots and rocks as he made his way back up to the roadside. As he reached the top and stood by the edge of the road, a car pulled over and a man got out, hurrying over to him. The man looked concerned, his face full of alarm as he approached. "Hey, are you okay?" he called out. My friend's boss took a deep breath, ready to reply. He turned around to face the man, feeling the intense relief of making it through. But the moment he turned his head, something snapped. He felt a sharp, searing pain at the base of his skull, like a lightning bolt shooting down his spine. He stumbled, the world around him fading to black in an instant, his body crumpling to the ground. The onlooker froze in horror, staring at him, too shocked to even react. The police and paramedics arrived shortly after, called by another driver who'd witnessed the accident, but there was nothing they could do. The small, weathered building sat on the outskirts of town, mostly unnoticed amid the thick trees and dense brush. Locals whispered about it, recalling tales of what might have happened inside, stories of disappearances and unsettling encounters. But for Daniel, the stories were just that, stories. He was a curious man, and that curiosity led him to the door of the old structure one chilly afternoon. As he stepped inside, the door creaked ominously behind him. Dust motes danced in the slanting light, and the air felt stale, almost suffocating. Daniel looked around, noting the peeling wallpaper and the remnants of furniture cloaked in shadows. He took a few hesitant steps forward, his boots echoing against the hardwood floor, feeling as though the building were watching him. He felt a shiver run down his spine, but he brushed it off. "It's just an old building," he muttered to himself. He turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, the sound reverberating in the silence. Heart racing, Daniel tried to pull the door open, but it wouldn't budge. Panic began to creep in. He turned back into the room, seeking another way out. There was only one window, covered with grime and shadows, but he could make out the silhouettes of trees outside. As he moved deeper into the building, he felt a strange heaviness in the air. Each breath became more laborious, as if the atmosphere itself were pressing down on him. Daniel began to feel lightheaded, and his vision started to blur. He stumbled toward what looked like a small office in the corner, hoping to find a phone or some way to signal for help. When he reached the desk, he bent over it, desperately trying to catch his breath. Suddenly, he gasped for air. The world around him faded to black as he collapsed onto the floor. Hours later, Detective Collins arrived at the scene and having been called to investigate the old building after concerned neighbors reported seeing Daniel enter and not return. He stepped inside, the heavy door creaking ominously as it swung open. The smell was overpowering, a mix of mold and something far more sinister. "Daniel?" he called out, but only silence responded. The detective moved deeper into the building, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The unease grew within him, a prickling sensation at the back of his neck. He approached the small office and felt his stomach twist when he spotted Daniel's body sprawled across the floor. Collins knelt down beside him, checking for signs of life, but it was clear Daniel was gone. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes stared blankly into the void. The detective fished out his phone and dialed 911, his heart racing. "This is Detective Collins. I'm at the old building on the outskirts of town. I need backup now." The operator responded, their voice distant. "Help is on the way, Detective. Please stay on the line." As he waited for the paramedics, Collins took another look around the room, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. It was too quiet, too still. He glanced back at Daniel's body, the weight of dread settling over him. It was as if the air itself had thickened, and he felt an overwhelming urge to leave. But before he could rise, the room swayed. Collins bent over, feeling a wave of dizziness wash over him. The darkness crept in at the edges of his vision, and he struggled to remain conscious. Just then, the operator's voice crackled through the phone, but he couldn't focus on her words. The ground felt as if it were shifting beneath him, and he suddenly couldn't breathe. Collins grasped his throat, gasping for air as the room spun wildly around him. He tried to call out to warn anyone who might hear him, but his voice failed him. Darkness enveloped him, and he crumpled to the floor next to Daniel. By the time the paramedics arrived, the scene was eerily quiet. They pushed open the door, the sound echoing in the empty building. "Detective Collins," one of them called, glancing around for any sign of life. But as they moved deeper into the building, an uneasy feeling washed over them. "Check in here," the first medic said, moving toward the small office. They hesitated for a moment, sensing something amiss, but their training pushed them forward. As they entered the room, they gasped at the sight of the two bodies lying on the floor. "Call for backup," one of the paramedics shouted, but it was too late. As he bent over to check Collins's pulse, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over him. The air felt thick and oppressive, and he struggled to draw a breath. "I can't." He stumbled backward, panic rising in his chest. His partner rushed to his side, but the same darkness began to consume her too. She grasped her throat, eyes wide with fear, as she collapsed to the ground beside him. The two medics lay motionless on the floor, trapped in a silent struggle against an invisible force. The air within the room grew heavier, and their bodies began to cool as they lost their fight for breath. The minutes dragged on, and the building remained silent, hiding its dark secrets from the outside world. As the sun began to set, the oppressive atmosphere thickened, casting shadows that danced ominously on the walls. Eventually, a concerned neighbor, having seen the paramedics arrive and not leave, called the police again. When they arrived, apprehension filled the air as they approached the old building. They exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what they might find inside. As they pushed the door open, the creaking echoed through the empty halls. The two officers stepped cautiously inside, the hairs on their arms standing on end. "Hello?" one called out, his voice shaky. But the building remained eerily quiet. They moved deeper into the darkness, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. When they reached the small office, they froze at the sight before them. 4 bodies lay sprawled on the floor, lifeless and cold. "What the hell happened here?" one officer whispered, his heart racing as he knelt beside Collins. His partner glanced around, trying to make sense of the situation. "We need to get out of here. This isn't right." But as he turned to leave, he felt a rush of air, thick and suffocating. The oppressive weight of the building bore down on him, and he stumbled, gasping for breath. He felt the walls closing in, darkness creeping in at the edges of his vision. "No!" he shouted, panic rising in his chest. But it was too late. The last thing he saw was the doorway dimming as he crumpled to the ground, lost in the clutches of the unseen horror that lingered within the building. Hours later, a larger police presence arrived, this time with more caution and a sense of dread. They entered the building, but what they found sent a chill down their spines. 4 bodies lay in that small room, each lifeless and cold, victims of the same sinister force that had claimed Daniel's life. The oxygen levels, it turned out, were normal at head height, but dangerously low when bending over. It was a room that seemed to trap its victims, feeding off their panic and fear, ensuring they would never escape. The investigators sealed the building, placing it on the list of places that held darkness and death within their walls. The townspeople would continue to whisper about the old structure, but now they had a real reason to fear it. A horror on the highway, waiting silently for its next unwitting victim. Growing up in New Delhi, life was filled with a swirl of loud streets, dense crowds, and all the things that seem normal to a child's eyes. Narrow alleys, brightly colored market stalls, and the familiar sounds of vendors calling out their wares. My world was a patchwork of school, friends, and the occasional trip through the crowded streets to my grandmother's home. But even in the warmth of my memories, there are shadows. One of the darkest things that blended into my childhood was something so horrific, I didn't even understand its gravity at the time. It was the way people would stumble across charred, lifeless bodies, discarded like trash in an alley, or sometimes left in a field near the neighborhood, far from prying eyes. You'd hear about them from a neighbor, or someone walking down the street would see a flash of a burnt hand or a corner of a sari blackened and torn. The murmurs would pass quickly through the neighborhood, carried by gasps and glances before dissolving into the background noise of daily life. As a child, it was both frightening and strangely routine. The whispers, the tense looks, the occasional sight of emergency responders hovering over a site, the clamor of voices, and the smell of burnt fabric or ash drifting through the air. These weren't rare sightings. There were times it happened often enough that we knew exactly what it meant without needing to hear the words. Another dowry case, someone would murmur, shaking their head with weary disgust. The adults would exchange glances. Sometimes they'd sigh or shake their heads, but life just moved on. No one paused long, and it was all brushed away as though this was just another part of the city, sounded like the crowded markets or the dust that hung heavy in the air. And to me, as a child, I only understood it in the barest of terms. I didn't know what dowry meant then. I only knew it was a thing adults would talk about in hushed, shameful voices whenever someone whispered that terrible word. Another one, they'd say, as though it was just part of the landscape. They'd hurry us along, shielding us from looking too closely. Sometimes, if it was too close to home, the women would say a few soft words in sorrow, eyes cast down. The men would look uncomfortable, avoid meeting each other's eyes. And just like that, the moment would pass. Years passed, and I left New Delhi. I grew up, moved to another country, and life continued with a completely different backdrop. My days became filled with other things, other places, other ways of life that slowly erased those memories. But years later, I found myself remembering as though some hidden lock in my mind had been opened, releasing a flood of images from my childhood, things I hadn't thought of in ages. One night, lying awake, my mind drifted back to those narrow alleys, those familiar sights. I could almost hear the hum of the city, smell the dust and spice in the air. And then, unbidden, came memories of those women. The recollections felt so distant that for a moment I wondered if they were real or just fragments of a forgotten nightmare. But the memories were too vivid. The sight of scorched clothing, the heavy, suffocating silence that fell over a crowd in those moments. The realization hit me then, a wave of horror crashing down. These were women who had been killed for something as arbitrary as a dowry, a tradition that, in some twisted way, became a death sentence. I remembered standing by as my parents and their friends whispered about it, their voices filled with resignation, helplessness, and even a hint of acceptance. There was one memory in particular that came back to me that night. It had happened on a sweltering afternoon when the heat clung to everything like a damp shroud. I was walking home from school with my friend, who lived a couple of doors down. The sun was high, the air heavy, and as we turned the corner into our street, we saw a crowd gathered near an alleyway, murmuring in hushed, anxious tones. My friend's grip tightened on my hand as we approached, drawn by the strange pull of the crowd. A police van was parked nearby, its lights flashing silently, casting an eerie glow on the faces around us. Through a gap in the crowd, I caught a glimpse of the figure on the ground. A woman lay there, her sari scorched, her skin blackened, her hair singed in places, her face partially covered. I didn't understand what I was seeing then, but there was something chilling about the stillness around her, about the way people looked at her with pity and resignation, but no surprise. A man beside us muttered, shaking his head, "Another one of those dowry cases." He spat the words like a curse, his face twisted with contempt, but there was nothing he, or anyone, could do. We stood there for a moment longer before someone finally ushered us away. But I remember the look on my friend's face, pale and grim, her hand gripping mine tightly. She didn't say a word, and neither did I as we walked back home. For years, that memory lay dormant, hidden under layers of other, brighter memories. And yet, here it was, resurfacing with brutal clarity. I couldn't fathom how I had grown so numb to such a horrific reality, how I'd accepted it as just another part of life back then. The normality of it was almost more horrifying than the act itself, how quickly and completely it had become part of the background, a dark undercurrent in the noisy, vibrant life of the city. Thinking back, I wondered about those women, those lives erased in an instant, leaving only whispers and burnt remnants. How many dreams had been extinguished in those brutal moments, lives cut short for the sake of a dowry? The questions lingered, echoing in my mind long after the memories had faded back into silence. In the stillness of that night, I realized that for all the beauty and chaos of the city I'd loved, there were shadows too. Dark places that, even as children, we had been taught to ignore. But now, years later, I could no longer look away. My mom was driving home late one night, returning from visiting a friend. It was a quiet stretch of road bordered by tall trees on either side, with only the hum of the car engine breaking the silence. The road was dimly lit, and only her headlights sliced through the shadows. She was halfway between the last town and our home, where there wasn't a streetlight in sight. Everything felt like it was wrapped in layers of black, and she could barely see 10 feet beyond her headlights. The radio was playing softly, and she'd told me later she'd almost felt lulled by the dark, empty road. Then, out of nowhere, a figure dashed across the road. My mom slammed on the brakes, her heart hammering in her chest as her car skidded slightly before coming to a stop. She could barely make out the man in front of her. He looked young, maybe in his early 20s, wearing dark clothes, and he was standing in the middle of the road with his hands raised, as if asking her to stop. She was stunned, gripping the wheel with sweaty palms, feeling the confusion and fear creep in. At first, she thought it might be a car breakdown, someone stranded on the road, needing help. But as she was processing the situation, she noticed movement in her peripheral vision. 3 more figures emerged from the trees on either side of the car. They were approaching quickly, purposefully, and each one had their eyes fixed on her. They looked rough, disheveled, and as they moved closer, she saw their hands reach out toward her car. Her mind was racing, trying to understand what was happening. This was a situation she'd only seen in movies, an ambush in the middle of the night on a deserted road. One of the men reached for the driver's side door, and another tried the passenger side. The sound of the handles rattling echoed in her ears, sending a chill down her spine. Her heart was pounding, and in that moment she realized the doors had locked automatically when she'd shifted into drive. The men pulled harder on the handles, getting more aggressive, shaking the car slightly as they tried to force their way in. She didn't have a moment to think, let alone breathe. Her instincts kicked in, and she knew she had to get out of there. Her hands were trembling as she gripped the wheel and hit the gas pedal hard. The car lurched forward, and as she sped off, she caught a glimpse of the men in her rearview mirror, their dark forms disappearing into the distance. She didn't slow down until she reached the next town. Her hands were still shaking, her heart still pounding as she pulled into a gas station that was thankfully still open. She took a few minutes to collect herself, feeling the adrenaline slowly drain away, but the fear lingered. What had just happened felt surreal, like a nightmare she'd only just escaped. She stayed at the gas station a while, trying to calm down and going over every moment in her mind, wondering what might have happened if her doors hadn't been locked. Steeped in history and haunted tales, the Driscoll Hotel in Austin is a must-visit for those seeking a spine-tingling experience. Built in 1886, this opulent hotel features ancient wells beneath its floors, rumored to contribute to its otherworldly atmosphere. With its grand architecture and elegantly decorated hallways that could easily be mistaken for a scene from The Shining, the Driscoll is rich in ghostly lore. Guests often report seeing the spirits of multiple bridal ghosts wandering through the hotel, particularly in the lobby and grand staircase areas. One popular tale tells of a bride who tragically died on her wedding day and now roams the hotel in her wedding dress, searching for her lost love. In 2017, a couple staying at the hotel shared a chilling encounter where they saw a fleeting figure in white glide down the hallway, disappearing into the wall. For those looking for a truly eerie experience, the most haunted rooms in the hotel are said to be rooms 525 and 429. In room 525, guests have reported disembodied voices, cold spots, and even the feeling of being watched. A guest in 2019 recounted waking up in the middle of the night to find the temperature had plummeted and the sensation of someone gently tugging at the sheets. When she turned on the light, she was alone, but the experience left her shaken. Room 429 has its own share of paranormal activity. People have described unexplained knocks on the door and eerie shadows moving across the walls. A notable incident occurred in 2020 when a guest recorded a video of a door in the hallway opening and closing on its own, despite being unoccupied. The video went viral, sparking further interest in the hotel's haunted reputation. Guests have also reported encounters with Colonel Jesse Driscoll, the hotel's founder, who passed away in 1890. Many claim to have seen him enjoying a cigar while gazing out at traffic from his room. In 2018, a visitor reported seeing a gentleman in period clothing seated by the window, only to discover that no one else was in the room when she looked again. The Driscoll Hotel's rich history, combined with its reputation for being haunted, makes it a fascinating destination for both history buffs and ghost enthusiasts alike. Whether you're drawn to its elegant charm or its ghostly residence, a stay at the Driscoll promises an unforgettable blend of luxury and the supernatural, if you dare to spend the night. Steeped in history and shrouded in mystery, La Carafe is a dimly lit tavern in Houston that dates back to 1847, making it the oldest building in the city. With its towering mounds of wax from countless candles illuminating the space, this bar has an undeniably eerie atmosphere that sets the stage for ghostly encounters. Patrons have long reported sightings and interactions with the spirit of Carl Truscott, an old bartender who passed away in the 1990s. Many claim to have experienced his lingering presence, often feeling a chill in the air or the sensation of someone standing behind them. In 2019, a group of friends enjoyed a night out at La Carafe when one of them swore he heard a disembodied voice shouting "last call" at an unexpected hour. At first, they thought it was a prank from one of the other patrons, but when they turned to look, they found no one near the bar. The bar's front windows are another hotspot for paranormal activity. Late at night, customers have reported seeing shadowy figures moving behind the glass, even when the tavern is closed. In 2021, a couple sitting near the window claimed they saw a figure waving them from outside, only to realize there was no one there when they stepped outside to investigate. Adding a touch of humor to the spooky ambiance, many patrons have complained about the tiny restrooms. On several occasions, people have waited for a bathroom stall only to find it empty upon entering. One night in 2020, a local blogger recounted how she felt someone brush past her in the cramped stall, despite being alone. She quickly exited, only to find the restroom completely empty and her friends waiting outside, completely oblivious to the incident. The combination of history, ghostly bartenders, and inexplicable occurrences makes La Carafe a must-visit for those brave enough to enjoy a drink in the company of spirits. Whether you're in the mood for a spooky tale or just a good cocktail, this haunted tavern promises an unforgettable experience filled with both laughter and chills. Just outside of Abilene, the small town of Anson is home to one of Texas' most mysterious and enduring ghostly phenomena, the Anson Lights. For decades, locals and visitors alike have been captivated by these unexplained glowing orbs that appear at night along a quiet stretch of country road. To experience the lights, you're instructed to drive east on US 180 until you reach the cemetery, then turn right onto a nearby country road. Continue driving until you reach a crossroad, then turn back around and face the direction you came. The final step is to turn off your engine and flash your headlights 3 times. Sure enough, as the legend promises, a strange glowing light will appear in the distance, hovering where moments earlier there was nothing but darkness. The most popular legend surrounding the Anson Lights is that they are the spirit of a grieving woman searching for her lost children. According to local lore, in the early 1900s, a woman sent her children out into the cold one evening, but they never returned. Distraught, she grabbed a lantern and wandered the area searching for them. It's said she continued looking for her children until the day she died, and her ghost has been seen ever since, still searching, her lantern glowing in the night. While many dismiss the lights as nothing more than car headlights or reflections, the sheer number of consistent sightings over the years has kept the legend alive. In the 1950s, several locals reported seeing the lights while returning home late at night, describing them as eerie, pulsating orbs that seemed to move along the road before fading into the darkness. In the 1980s, a group of college students from nearby Abilene drove out to see the lights and witnessed a glowing ball of light that followed their car for several minutes before disappearing. In 2005, a paranormal investigation team visited the site to capture the lights on film. They followed the same procedure, driving to the crossroads, flashing their headlights, and to their astonishment, a glowing orb appeared. Despite trying to debunk the phenomenon as light pollution or some natural cause, the investigators left without a clear explanation. Even locals who have lived near the cemetery for years are divided. Some claim they've seen the lights many times, while others believe it's an illusion caused by passing cars or atmospheric conditions. Yet, those who have experienced it firsthand, especially on nights when no cars are nearby, find it hard to dismiss as a simple trick of the eye. One farmer from the area reported seeing the light multiple times growing up and swore it wasn't coming from any car, especially since it seemed to float over fields where no road existed. Whether you believe the Anson Lights are the spirit of a heartbroken mother or just a strange optical illusion, there's no denying the legend has endured for generations. The mystery continues to draw curious souls to the crossroads, eager to see for themselves the glowing light that has puzzled so many for decades. On a tragic rainy morning in San Antonio, a school bus carrying children stalled on a railroad crossing. Unable to move in time, the bus was struck by an oncoming train, resulting in a devastating crash that claimed the lives of 10 children. This heartbreaking event left a lasting mark on the community. But in the years since, a chilling legend has emerged surrounding the tracks on Shane Road. According to the story, the spirits of the children who perished in the accident remain at the site, and they now work to prevent the same tragedy from happening again. It is said that if a car stalls or stops near the tracks, the ghosts will push it to safety, away from the danger of an approaching train. To experience the phenomenon for yourself, locals suggest parking about 50 feet before the tracks, putting your car in neutral, and turning off the engine. Without touching the gas or steering, your vehicle will begin to move uphill, seemingly pushed by unseen hands, and cross over the tracks. As eerie as that sounds, the legend takes it a step further. Many who try the experiment are encouraged to dust their car's rear bump with baby powder beforehand. After crossing the tracks, they claim to find tiny fingerprints on the bumper, proof, they say, of the ghostly children who helped them. Over the years, many have tested the story, and the results have been consistent enough to keep the legend alive. In the 1970s, a family reported their car moving over the tracks in neutral, convinced they were helped by something beyond this world. In the 1980s, a group of teenagers claimed to find handprints in the baby powder after a midnight visit. In 2002, a paranormal investigator recorded footage of a car moving uphill without any apparent force driving it. Despite skeptics attributing the car's movement to a natural optical illusion, where the incline is actually a downhill slope that appears to be uphill, those who experience it firsthand often walk away believing there's more to the story. Some witnesses say they've heard faint laughter or whispers while crossing the tracks, adding a personal and haunting touch to the already chilling tale. The legend of the San Antonio Ghost Tracks remains one of the city's most famous ghost stories. Whether it's the spirits of the children looking out for others or simply a quirk of physics, one thing is certain: people keep returning to Shane Road to test the tale, hoping to catch a glimpse of the supernatural. Athens may be known for its small-town charm and outdoor adventures, but it also harbors a darker history that will leave you uneasy. Tucked away on West College Street is a spot known to locals as Monkey Bridge, where an unsettling legend was born. The story goes that years ago, a circus train derailed violently under what is now called Thunder Bridge. Among the wreckage, the surviving monkeys escaped into the nearby woods, but many were killed in the accident. Locals swear that the restless spirits of these animals still haunt the overgrown area around the bridge, their cries sometimes heard on quiet nights. But that's not where the story ends. According to legend, Medford Fuller, a wealthy but reclusive figure in town, was said to have gathered up the escaped monkeys. Fuller owned a large estate nearby, now known as Fuller Park. It is believed that he caged the surviving monkeys there, performing strange rituals in the secluded woods. The rumors of animal cruelty and dark ceremonies only fueled the chilling atmosphere surrounding the park, which to this day remains overgrown and abandoned. Visitors claim to have seen the remains of giant iron cages where the monkeys were once kept, as well as eerie stone structures crumbling with age. Adding to the eerie vibe is the fact that Medford Fuller's grave is still located within the park's dense forest. Those brave enough to explore its tangled trails have reported strange occurrences, phantom sounds of screeching, rustling in the bushes, and sightings of shadowy figures darting among the trees. One local teenager in the late 1990s claimed to have felt invisible hands brushing against his back as he passed through the area late at night. In the early 2000s, a group of friends exploring the park swore they heard distant chattering sounds, almost like the calls of monkeys, though none were around. Despite its overgrown state, the park still draws curious explorers, some of whom come across the old cages and remnants of Fuller's mysterious rituals. Paranormal investigators have tried to capture evidence of the hauntings, reporting strange energy readings and cold spots near the bridge and Fuller's grave. Although Fuller Park remains a local curiosity, many Athens residents prefer to stay away, letting the dark history and ghostly legends live on in whispers. Aboard the historic USS Lexington in Corpus Christi, you might not encounter Casper the friendly ghost, but you could meet Charlie, a ghostly tour guide who has left more than a few visitors puzzled and spooked. Many guests have reported meeting a striking, kind young man with blue eyes, dressed in a crisp naval uniform, who cheerfully leads them on tours of the lower decks. It's only when these visitors return to ask staff about the guide that they're told something unsettling. The Lexington doesn't have tour guides stationed in the lower decks. That's when the real chills set in. Charlie isn't just a ghost story. His tragic death is part of the Lexington's wartime history. He was an engine room operator who lost his life in 1943 when a Japanese torpedo struck the ship. While his physical presence is long gone, his spirit seems to have remained, carrying on his duties in the ship's depths. Over the years, countless visitors and staff have had encounters with Charlie. In one well-known incident from the early 1990s, a family touring the ship recalled following a friendly guide who gave them a detailed explanation of the engine room's machinery. He was so knowledgeable and personable that they tried to tip him after the tour. When they returned to the front desk to praise the guide, they were met with confused looks. There was no record of any staff member matching the description. Other crew members stationed aboard the museum have had their own unexplained experiences. One staff member reported seeing a young man standing in the engine room, staring out into the distance, only for him to vanish moments later. Another visitor in the 2000s claimed to feel a sudden cold gust and hear footsteps behind them while exploring the lower decks, though they were alone at the time. Some even say they've heard faint voices and the hum of machinery long after the ship has shut down for the day. Paranormal investigators have spent nights aboard the USS Lexington, reporting unusual electromagnetic activity and temperature drops, particularly in the areas where Charlie is said to linger. Despite the spooky occurrences, many visitors leave feeling more charmed than frightened, as though Charlie's friendly spirit continues to guide and protect those who venture through the ship's haunted halls. On a bitterly cold, icy morning in Lubbock, tragedy struck on Memphis Avenue. A man was standing at the bus stop waiting for his ride when the bus skidded on a patch of ice and fatally hit him. Though the incident happened decades ago, the memory of that fateful day lingers in a haunting way. Locals say that if you drive north on Memphis Avenue at night, near the corner of 66th Street, you might catch a glimpse of something eerie, the shadowy figure of a man leaning against the light pole, just as he had on that fateful morning. But here's where the story takes an even more chilling turn. As drivers approach, the man vanishes. Many have reported this strange sight over the years, claiming to see the figure waiting at the bus stop, only for him to disappear as they get closer. One woman in the late 1980s said she saw the man during a late-night drive and even slowed down to ask if he needed help. As her headlights illuminated the spot, he was simply gone. In the early 2000s, a college student swore she saw the same man while heading home one night. At first, she thought it was a pedestrian waiting for the bus, but when she blinked, the figure vanished right before her eyes. Locals familiar with the tragic story of the Memphis Man believe it's his restless spirit is forever waiting for a bus that will never come. Others, more skeptical, think it might just be tricks of the light or reflections off the ice, but the consistency of the sightings makes it hard to dismiss entirely. Paranormal investigators have visited the area, recording strange phenomena like temperature drops and unexplained cold spots, especially around the light pole where the man is often seen. Even though Memphis Avenue has changed over the years, with more traffic and development, sightings of the Memphis Man continue, keeping this tragic ghost story alive in Lubbock's memory. The library was never quiet, not really. Even when the lights dimmed and the air felt like it could press you flat against the bookshelves, there was always a hum, a whisper, maybe a heartbeat that pulsed through its endless corridors. People came and went, most of them with a purpose. They knew where they were going, what they were looking for. But then there were those who came for a different reason, the ones who weren't sure if they wanted to be found again. My job was to keep track of them all. Most days it was easy, a few hours of wandering the stacks, checking on the shelves, listening to the murmurs of the watchers. They saw everything, but today things had gone wrong. Someone was missing. 6 hours. I had been searching for 6 hours, and not a single soul had checked out. It was unusual, worrying. Most of the time, if someone wandered off, I'd find them in a corner, nose deep in some obscure text, eyes glazed over as if they'd forgotten what the real world looked like. But this was different. This one had crossed the tape. The tape. The very thought of it made my stomach churn. Hazard tape, bright yellow, warning people to stay away. But this place, it was a maze, and the more forbidden something was, the more enticing it became. Some people couldn't resist. I had to go back to my desk to prepare. The broom closet was where I kept the necessary supplies for ventures beyond the tape. The helmet came first, heavy, old-fashioned, like something out of a deep-sea diving suit. I hated wearing it, but it was essential. There were things beyond the tape, things that shouldn't see my face. The light on the front of the helmet would help, but it was also a beacon, a signal that I was out there, moving through their territory. And some of them, well, they like to play. Next was the sack, non-perishables, tinctures, aspirin. You wouldn't believe how many times I'd seen explorers driven to the brink of madness just by the pressure of this place. There was the compass, too, but it wasn't like any compass you'd find outside these walls. The needle didn't point north. It pointed to other things. Lastly, I strapped on the flamethrower. A small one, sure, but effective. You'd be surprised how often it came in handy. The creatures in the library didn't like fire. Most of them. I wasn't the librarian. I was just an assistant. But I had been doing this long enough to know how to survive beyond the tape. I only called for the head librarian if things got truly dire. And they hadn't. Not yet. The tape wasn't far, thank God. Sometimes it moved on its own, shifting deeper into the library, making my job harder. But today, the watchers had kept it in place. They knew I was coming. The air grew heavier as I approached, the lights dimming even further. I crouched, crawling beneath the crisscross of reflective strips, feeling the temperature drop. The tape wasn't just a warning. It was a boundary, a barrier between the library's known shelves and the rest. I felt the chill in my bones as I passed through, my lamp flickering as it illuminated the twisted spines of books on shelves that shouldn't be there. The watchers stopped here. Beyond the tape, there were only the listeners. I didn't like them as much. They didn't see, they only heard. It made things less predictable. I walked for what felt like hours, though I knew had only been a few minutes. Time was strange beyond the tape, stretching and warping, bending itself to the will of the library. I felt the familiar pressure building in my temples, the telltale sign that I was getting closer. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a struggle as my vision blurred at the edges. I popped a couple of aspirin into my mouth, chewing them bitterly. I couldn't afford to lose focus now. My fingers tingled, and I knew I was getting close. The rocks at my feet shifted, rolling and tumbling toward a central point. Good. I was on the right path. I clicked the compass once, just to be sure, before stuffing it back into the sack. I didn't need it anymore. The breathing was the first thing I heard. Shallow, rasping, like someone was trying to pull air through a throat that had forgotten how. The rocks picked up speed, skittering ahead of me down a narrow aisle lined with books that hadn't been opened in decades. Their spines were cracked, their pages yellowed and curling, but they pulsed with life. I could feel it. Each step I took felt like it echoed 1,000 times over, reverberating through the empty space around me. There. In the distance, hunched over on the floor, was the lost soul I'd been searching for. A girl. Young. Maybe too young to understand what she'd gotten herself into. The book clung to her face like a leech, its pages fluttering against her skin as if it was breathing her in. Her body was thin, too thin, as though the life was being sucked out of her one page at a time. I approached slowly, carefully. The rocks were gathering around her, swirling in a strange, almost reverent dance. I felt a pang of sorrow for her. She hadn't meant to get lost here. None of them did. The book wasn't going to give her up easily. It never did. I pulled a vial from my belt, uncorking it with a sharp pop. The smell was faint, almost nothing, but the effect was immediate. The girl moaned softly as I poured a bit of the liquid onto the spine of the book. It shuddered, as if in pain, and the grip it had on her head loosened. I could hear its sorrow, its desperation. It didn't want to let her go, but it had no choice. "Come on," I murmured, knocking gently on the cover. "It's time to let go." With a final reluctant sigh, the book released its hold. I pulled it away, careful not to tear any more of her soul with it. The girl slumped against me, her eyes wide and empty, her skin cold. She wasn't all there yet. It would take time for her to recover. But she would. They always did, at least the ones I found in time. I carried her back, her limp body barely weighing anything at all. The dark closed in around us, but I didn't look back. I knew better. The library didn't like to be watched when it was rearranging itself. By the time we made it back to my desk, she was starting to breathe again. Real breaths this time, not the shallow wheezing I'd heard before. I laid her down on the couch, draping a blanket over her and setting the kettle on for tea. She would be fine. People like her always were. People like me? Well, we stayed lost forever. It has been a somber week. I accidentally hit a dog that darted into the road while I was driving. I wasn't speeding. She struck my back tire, so I didn't have to choose between braking, swerving, or continuing forward to avoid a worse accident. I pulled over, wrapped her in my daughter's pink towel with little bear ears on the hood, and held her as she passed away without a sound. Maybe T.S. Eliot was wrong after all. My first instinct was to call my father, but he's been gone for almost 5 years now. It's strange how, even after all this time, I still haven't broken the habit of reaching for the phone to call him whenever I'm in trouble. That got me thinking about memory, ghosts, and what remains with us after death, what we take and what we leave behind. I reached for Eric Rosenthal's They Walk in the Night, a collection of South Africa's most famous ghost stories, and began rereading it. It took me back to slumber parties, giggling with friends, eating sweetened condensed milk straight from the tin, and scaring ourselves senseless with ghost stories. South Africa has been inhabited for over 100,000 years, so it's no wonder there's an abundance of ghostly tales woven into the landscape. But today I'll focus on the haunting of South Africa's oldest colonial building, the Castle of Good Hope in Cape Town. Constructed by the Dutch between 1666 and 1679, the castle has been the setting for many ghostly encounters over the centuries. Among the most famous spirits is the Grey Lady, who haunted both the castle and government house. She was said to travel through a collapsed tunnel between the two buildings, but after a female skeleton was unearthed in the castle grounds in the 1940s, the Grey Lady was never seen again. Then there's the story of Governor Van Noot, whose cruelty left a haunting of his own. He died suddenly in his chair just as 7 prisoners he'd sentenced to death were being hanged. Unlike the Grey Lady, Van Noot's spirit is said to be more aggressive, even dislodging plaster from the ceiling and muttering about the sad state of his office. But my favorite tale from the castle comes from 1947, when members of the Union Defense Force, stationed there at the time, reported a sighting that left even the toughest soldiers quaking. Over the course of 3 nights in July, an 8-foot-tall, semi-transparent apparition was spotted on the ramparts. On the first night, the guards approached the figure in a coordinated pincer movement, but before they could reach it, the ghost leapt off the battlements and vanished into thin air above the old moat. 3 nights later, the same figure was seen again. Determined to rule out any possibility of a practical joke, Corporal Boonzair enlisted the help of Private Snagans to haunt the battlements while draped in a sheet, but the soldiers weren't convinced. Their laughter dispelled any notion that someone in a sheet could be responsible for the eerie sightings. On the final night, however, the ghost reappeared, this time ringing the bells in the guardroom. The troops, now fully terrified, stopped laughing and found themselves drenched in cold sweat. When Boonzair filed his report with the commander of the castle, the military police were instructed to keep an eye out for pranksters. But with no instructions in the military code on how to deal with ghosts, they simply carried on with their duties, leaving the mystery unsolved. In times of grief and loss, it's the ghosts of our memories that linger the longest, isn't it? The Mirror Incident. It was a cool autumn evening in Springfield, Missouri. Sarah Harper, a 22-year-old college student, had recently moved into her first apartment near campus. The place was small but cozy, filled with secondhand furniture, a few of her mom's old decorative pieces, and a large antique mirror that she had found at a yard sale. She loved the vintage feel of the mirror. Its wooden frame had a few cracks, but it added character. After a long day of classes and a shift at the local diner, Sarah finally settled into her new routine. Her roommate, Jenny, was out for the weekend visiting her parents, so she had the place to herself. She decided to unwind by watching some TV and scrolling through social media before heading to bed. Around 11 p.m., she turned off the TV, grabbed her phone, and walked to her bedroom. The hallway leading to her room had the mirror hanging at the end, right near the bathroom door. As she passed by the mirror, something made her pause. She glanced at her reflection and felt a strange sensation of being watched. Shaking off the feeling, she continued into her bedroom and got ready for bed. Lying down, she stared at the ceiling, trying to let her thoughts drift away, but she couldn't shake the odd feeling from earlier. She told herself it was just her imagination running wild from being alone. Around 1 a.m., she was startled awake by the sound of something falling in the hallway. The thud was followed by a soft creak, like someone walking slowly. Her heart raced. Was someone inside the apartment? She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight. Slowly, she opened her bedroom door and peeked out. The hallway was empty, but the it seemed different. The air felt heavier, as if something was out of place. Sarah cautiously approached the mirror, her bare feet making almost no sound on the wooden floor. When she stood in front of the mirror, her reflection looked back at her, but something was wrong. The reflection of the hallway behind her wasn't empty. There was a figure standing there, just barely visible in the dim light. A tall, dark shape loomed behind her, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as though it were studying her. Sarah whipped around, expecting to find someone, but the hallway behind her was empty. She stared in disbelief. When she turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone, but her reflection seemed distorted, as if the glass were warped. She took a step back, trying to process what she had just seen. Her breath quickened, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Without thinking, she yanked the mirror off the wall and shoved it face down onto the floor. Terrified, she ran back to her bedroom and locked the door. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She stayed up for the rest of the night, too scared to sleep, her mind racing with thoughts of what she had just witnessed. The next morning, when Jenny returned, Sarah told her everything. Jenny, ever the skeptic, laughed it off, saying that Sarah must have been dreaming or that her mind was playing tricks on her from exhaustion. But Sarah couldn't shake the memory of that shadowy figure in the mirror. A few days later, they decided to get rid of the mirror. Sarah sold it online to a buyer who didn't ask many questions, but she never told them the real reason for selling it. She didn't want to think about what might still be lingering on the other side of that glass. From that day forward, Sarah avoided mirrors, especially in the dark. She couldn't help but wonder if the shadowy figure had been real or if she had imagined the whole thing. But deep down, she knew the truth. There was something in that mirror, something that didn't belong, and she wasn't going to take any chances with it ever again. Father John. Father John Mendez had been transferred to St. Michael's Parish in downtown Chicago only a few months ago. At 31, he was still relatively young for a priest, but his sharp intellect and calm demeanor had quickly earned him respect within the diocese. His previous experience assisting with exorcisms in a small Pennsylvania parish was rare, even among clergy, but he had never led one on his own. That was about to change. One evening, Father John received a call from Bishop Daniels. The Malone family had reached out, desperate for help with their daughter, Margaret. The bishop's voice was stern, but there was an underlying urgency to it. "It's serious, John. You need to see this for yourself." Margaret Malone was just 12 years old, but in the past few months, her behavior had taken a terrifying turn. According to her parents, she had started to speak in voices that weren't her own, act violently, and show a strange aversion to religious symbols. They had taken her to doctors and psychologists, but no one could explain the sudden transformation. Her parents were convinced something darker was at play. Father John met the Malones at their modest suburban home just outside the city. Mr. and Mrs. Malone looked worn down as if they hadn't slept in weeks. Margaret's older brother, Brian, stood by silently, his eyes filled with fear and confusion. Mrs. Malone led Father John into Margaret's bedroom, her hands trembling. "She's been locked in there for her own safety," she whispered. "We didn't know what else to do." Father John nodded and asked to be left alone with the girl. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. The room was dimly lit by a small lamp on the nightstand, casting long shadows on the walls. Margaret sat on the bed, her hair disheveled, her eyes dark and sunken. She looked far older than 12. "Hello, Margaret," Father John said gently, approaching the bed. Margaret's head snapped up and she stared at him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. She smiled, but it wasn't the smile of a child. It was twisted, unnatural. "Father John," she said, her voice low and guttural, completely unlike the voice of a young girl. "We've been waiting for you." He felt a chill run down his spine, but he kept his composure. "Who are you?" he asked calmly. Margaret, or whatever was inside her, let out a low, mocking laugh. "I am many," she replied, "and you are too late." Father John took out his Bible and began to read passages aloud, praying under his breath. Margaret's body tensed, her eyes rolling back into her head. She thrashed violently, the bed shaking beneath her, Her voice grew louder, deeper, and her words became a mix of different languages, some of which Father John didn't recognize. As he continued to pray, Margaret let out a piercing scream, then collapsed back onto the bed, unconscious. Father John paused, beads of sweat forming on his brow. He had seen enough to know that this was no ordinary case. The battle ahead would be difficult, and he would need the full authority of the church to proceed. After discussing the situation with the Malones and the bishop, Father John prepared for the formal rite of exorcism. It was a dangerous process, both spiritually and physically, and he made sure the Malones understood the risks. They were desperate. They agreed to anything that might save their daughter. The exorcism was scheduled for the following night. The Malones had gathered a few trusted family members and close friends to offer their prayers and support. Father John arrived with another priest, Father Thomas, to assist him in the rite. The room was filled with the scent of incense, and the walls were lined with religious artifacts, crucifixes, holy water, statues of saints. Margaret lay in the center of the room, her wrists and ankles tied to the bed for her own safety. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes half closed, but Father John could sense the presence of something dark lurking within her. As the exorcism began, Father John recited the prayers with precision and determination. Father Thomas sprinkled holy water around the room, and the group of family members prayed fervently. Margaret began to convulse, her body straining against the restraints. Her voice, now deeper, more menacing, spoke in riddles, taunting Father John with threats and blasphemies. At one point, Margaret's voice shifted, and she began speaking in perfect Spanish, a language she had never learned. Father John recognized the dialect. It was old, almost ancient, as if it belonged to another time. "Leave this child," Father John commanded, his voice rising with authority. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to leave." Margaret's body arched off the bed, her mouth opening in a silent scream. The room grew cold, and a sudden gust of wind knocked over the nearby lamp, plunging the room into near darkness. Father John didn't falter. He pressed on, reciting the final prayers of the rite. After what felt like hours, Margaret let out a blood-curdling scream, and then, just as suddenly, her body went limp. The room fell silent. Father John, exhausted but resolute, watched as Margaret's breathing returned to normal. Her eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in months, they were clear. The presence that had held her captive was gone. The Malones wept with relief, thanking Father John and Father Thomas profusely. Margaret, still weak but free, looked around the room, confused but calm. Father John, though relieved, knew that the battle against such evil was never truly over. He had won this fight, but the darkness would always be out there waiting for another opportunity. As he left the Malone house that night, Father John whispered a silent prayer, asking for strength in the battles to come. The Midnight Visitor. It was late November in a quiet town in northern Idaho. Michael Reed, a truck driver, was driving home with his wife, Rachel, and their teenage son, Sam, after visiting Rachel's family for Thanksgiving. The long stretch of road seemed endless, with nothing but the dark sky above and the barren fields on either side. Sam, sitting in the back seat, was dozing off when suddenly Rachel spotted someone on the side of the road, flagging them down. It was a man, drenched from head to toe as if he had been caught in a sudden downpour, though there hadn't been any rain that night. His clothes were ragged, and his face, hidden under a baseball cap, was almost completely obscured by the shadows. "Should we stop?" Rachel asked, her voice uneasy. Michael slowed the car, unsure if they should. "Maybe he needs help," he muttered, pulling over to the side. The man approached, his movements stiff and awkward. Sam woke up just as the man reached the window, peering curiously at the stranger. The man leaned down, his face partially hidden by the brim of his cap. "Car broke down," he said in a low voice. "Mind giving me a lift to the nearest town? My place is just a mile ahead." Michael glanced at Rachel, who looked uncertain, then at Sam in the back seat, who had suddenly grown quiet. Sure. Get in," Michael said, unlocking the passenger door. The man hesitated for a second, then opened the door and sat down beside Michael, not saying a word. As they drove, Michael tried to make small talk, asking him where he was coming from and what happened to his car. The man's answers were short, vague. Something about his demeanor put Michael on edge. Sam leaned forward from the back seat, looking at the stranger with curiosity. He tried to lighten the mood by cracking a joke. "Hey, you don't have a body in your trunk, do you?" The man didn't laugh. He didn't even react. Instead, he just stared straight ahead, his fingers tapping rhythmically on his knee. The atmosphere in the car grew thick with tension. Michael's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Where exactly did you say your place was?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just a little further up," the man said, his voice now barely above a whisper. After what felt like an eternity, the man finally pointed to a small dirt road off the main highway. "Turn here," he instructed. Michael turned, following the narrow road deeper into the woods. The car's headlights illuminated the path, but beyond that, there was only darkness. Rachel glanced nervously at Michael. This was not a good idea. The road eventually led to an old, rundown farmhouse, barely visible in the moonlight. The man reached for the door handle, but before getting out, he turned to Michael, his face still hidden under the brim of his cap. "Thanks for the ride," he said, his voice now eerily calm. "You should leave now, and don't look back." Without another word, he stepped out of the car and disappeared into the shadows of the house. Michael felt a shiver run down his spine. "Let's go," he said to Rachel and Sam, his voice shaking. He put the car in reverse, not daring to stay any longer than necessary. As they backed away, Michael's heart raced. He didn't look back at the farmhouse, but Sam, sitting in the back seat, couldn't resist. He turned his head, peering through the rear window. "Dad," Sam whispered, his voice trembling. "He's standing there, in the window, watching us." Michael pressed down on the gas, speeding back toward the highway. No one spoke for the rest of the drive home. That night, none of them could sleep. The man's haunting presence lingered in their minds, especially Sam's. He couldn't shake the image of the stranger standing in the farmhouse window, staring after them. The next day, Michael decided to drive back along that road, determined to find out more about the man. But when he reached the dirt road, it wasn't there. The farmhouse was gone, as if it had never existed. Michael stopped the car, staring at the empty field where the house should have been. "Weird," he muttered to himself, trying to make sense of what had happened. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. Something about that night had been wrong from the start. As he drove home, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that they had encountered something or someone not of this world, and he knew, without a doubt, that they had been lucky to get away. The Circle. It started like any other night for Melissa Warner. She sat in her room, the soft glow of her computer screen illuminating the darkened space, headphones on, chatting with her best friends on their group call. It was a typical Friday night, with no real plans other than talking and maybe playing a game or two online. Her friends, Taylor, Beth, and Jordan, were all scattered across town, and they often hung out like this, virtually connected, yet physically apart. But tonight, there was something different in the air. Maybe it was the way the wind howled outside, or the strange static that seemed to come through the headphones now and then. "I heard about this weird website," Taylor said, her voice crackling slightly through the connection. "It's like a game, but it's super creepy. It's called The Circle." "A game?" Beth asked, sounding intrigued. "What kind of game?" Taylor's voice dropped a little, as if she were telling a secret. "It's supposed to be this urban legend. You join the circle, and if you follow the rules, you'll be fine. But if you break any of them, bad things happen." Jordan laughed. "Oh, come on, that sounds like some made-up internet crap. What's supposed to happen?" "I don't know all the details," Taylor replied. "I just heard people talking about it online. They said it's not like anything you've ever seen. Supposedly, you don't play the circle. It plays you." Melissa felt a shiver run down her spine. She wasn't superstitious, but something about the way Taylor was describing it gave her the creeps. "Let's try it," Beth said suddenly. "Come on, it's probably just some dumb site. We'll play for a few minutes, get scared, and then laugh about it." "Yeah," Jordan agreed. "What's the worst that could happen?" Melissa hesitated, but curiosity got the better of her. "All right," she said, "let's do it." Taylor sent them the link, and Melissa clicked on it, her screen going black for a moment before a single white circle appeared in the center. No title, no instructions, just the circle. "Is this it?" Beth asked, sounding unimpressed. "Hold on," Taylor said. I think we have to start the game first. Everyone type your names into the chat and press enter. Melissa's fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she typed her name, Melissa, and hit enter. One by one, the others followed suit. Taylor, Beth, and Jordan. The circle on Melissa's screen began to spin slowly and a new message appeared in the center. Welcome to the circle. Follow the rules and you will be rewarded. Break the rules and you will face the consequences. What are the rules? Jordan asked, sounding more interested now. Another message appeared. Rule 1, do not leave the circle until the game is finished. Beth chuckled nervously. Well, we're all stuck now. Rule 2, obey the circle's commands without question. Melissa's heart started to race. Okay, this is getting weird. Suddenly, a third message flashed on the screen. The game begins now. For a few moments, nothing happened. The circle on her screen spun lazily, and Melissa could hear her friend's nervous breathing through her headphones. Then a new message appeared. Taylor, stand up. Wait, what? Taylor's voice was uneasy. How does it know I'm sitting down? Just do it. Beth urged. It's probably some kind of weird trick. Taylor sighed, and through the faint sound of her microphone, Melissa heard the shuffle of movement. Okay, I'm standing, Taylor said. The circle stopped spinning, and a message flashed. Good. Beth, turn off your bedroom light. Beth hesitated for a moment, but then Melissa heard the click of a switch, and Beth's voice came through. Done. Jordan, open your bedroom window. Jordan groaned. It's freezing outside. But after a pause, Melissa heard the creak of a window being opened, and Jordan's voice followed. There? Happy? Melissa felt her stomach twist as the next message appeared. Melissa, go to your front door and open it. Her heart pounded in her chest. She didn't want to do it. Something about this game felt wrong, but she didn't want to be the only one to back out. Slowly, she stood from her desk and made her way down the dark hallway, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She reached the front door, hesitated for a moment, and then turned the handle, pulling it open. The cold night air rushed in, and she stared out into the empty street. Nothing moved. I did it, Melissa said, her voice shaking slightly as she closed the door and hurried back to her room. When she sat down, the circle on her screen spun faster. Another message appeared. Good. You are all doing well. The game continued for what felt like hours. The commands grew stranger and more unsettling. Taylor was told to hide under her bed. Beth was instructed to hold her breath for a full minute. Jordan had to take a picture of himself in the bathroom mirror and send it to the group. Finally, a new message flashed on the screen. The final round has begun. Only one of you can remain in the circle. What? Taylor's voice was panicked. What does that mean? Choose who stays. The others will leave. No way, Jordan said, his voice shaking. This is messed up. Guys, I don't like this anymore, Beth whispered. Let's just stop. But the next message appeared before anyone could respond. Melissa, choose who stays. Melissa's hands trembled over the keyboard. No, I can't. You must choose or all will be punished. Her mind raced. Her friends were silent, waiting for her decision. She couldn't do it. She couldn't choose. But the next message flashed, 10 seconds to choose. The timer began to count down on the screen. Panic surged through her, and in a blind moment of fear, she typed, Taylor. The circle on her screen spun faster and faster until it abruptly stopped. The words "the circle has spoken" appeared, and then her screen went black. Taylor? Melissa whispered into the silence of the call. Beth? Jordan? No one responded. Melissa waited, staring at the dark screen, but the call remained eerily silent. She tried to reconnect, to send messages, but nothing worked. Then her phone buzzed. A single message lit up the screen. You're next! Her heart froze. It was one of those late summer nights in the small town of Elk Hollow when the air was still thick with humidity and the crickets chirped incessantly. The kind of night when everything felt alive, but you weren't sure if that was a good thing. 4 teenagers, Amber, Kyle, Lizzie, and Trevor, sat huddled in a circle around a small bonfire in the clearing near the woods. Amber was the ringleader. She always had been. With her sharp wit and fearless attitude, she was the one who suggested they do something different for once, something to break the monotony of their lazy summer nights. So, here's the deal, Amber said, pulling out a worn old deck of cards from her backpack. This is no ordinary game. These cards belong to a witch, an actual witch from the old days. My grandma gave them to me, said they were cursed. Kyle rolled his eyes. Come on, Amber, you don't actually believe that stuff, do you? Amber shrugged, a sly smile on her lips. Doesn't matter if I believe it or not. The question is, do you? Trevor, always the skeptic, laughed. Witch cards? Seriously? What kind of game is this? The witch's Uno? Lizzie, sitting quietly next to Trevor, shivered a little despite the warmth of the fire. She didn't believe in ghosts or curses, but something about the cards made her uneasy. They were old, the edges frayed, and there was a strange energy in the air since Amber had pulled them out. It's called the Witch's Game, Amber said, flipping over the top card of the deck and placing it on the ground between them. It was a black card with a single white symbol on it, a circle with strange markings. Okay, so what are the rules? Kyle asked, leaning forward. Amber's smile widened. There are 3 rules. Rule 1, we each have to take a card from the deck, one at a time. Rule 2, whatever is written on your card, you have to do it no matter what. Rule 3, you can't stop playing until the deck is empty. Lizzie glanced at the deck nervously. And if we break the rules? Amber's eyes flickered with excitement. That's when the witch comes for you. The group sat in silence for a moment, the crackling of the fire filling the air. Then, with a shrug, Kyle reached forward and grabbed the first card. He flipped it over and read the writing out loud. Stay silent for the next 5 minutes. Kyle smirked and leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. He didn't seem fazed at all, but Amber was watching him closely, her eyes glinting in the firelight. Your turn, Trevor, Amber said, pushing the deck toward him. Trevor rolled his eyes again, but picked up a card. He looked at it, then frowned. Go to the edge of the woods and wait there for 2 minutes. Amber raised an eyebrow. Well, what are you waiting for? Trevor stood up, grumbling to himself as he walked toward the edge of the clearing. The others watched as his figure disappeared into the shadows, the light from the fire barely illuminating his retreating form. Okay, Lizzie, you're up, Amber said, holding out the deck to her. Lizzie hesitated. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked a card. She flipped it over and read it out loud, her voice barely above a whisper. Tell the group your deepest fear. Her heart pounded in her chest. She didn't want to do this. She could feel Amber's eyes on her, waiting, expecting, but a cold dread filled her as she remembered the rules. She couldn't refuse. Taking a deep breath, Lizzie looked at her friends and said, I'm afraid of drowning. I've had this nightmare since I was a kid, sinking into the water, and I can't breathe. I can see the surface, but I can't reach it. The group was silent. Even Kyle, who was under the rule of silence, looked at her with a newfound seriousness in his eyes. Amber nodded approvingly. Good. Now my turn. She picked a card and flipped it over, her smile faltering for just a second. Then she read aloud, Choose someone to leave the game. Kyle's eyes widened. He couldn't speak, but his face was full of disbelief. Lizzie's heart raced, and even from the edge of the woods, Trevor called out, Hey! No way! Amber's grin returned, more wicked than before. She looked around the group, her gaze lingering on each of them. Finally, she pointed at Lizzie. Lizzie, you're out. Lizzie's blood ran cold. Wait, what does that mean? I'm just done playing, right? Amber said nothing, her smile fading. The fire crackled louder, the shadows from the trees growing longer, almost as if they were closing in on the group. And then, from the edge of the woods, a scream ripped through the air. Trevor came stumbling back into the clearing, his face pale as death. Something's out there, he shouted. I saw it! It's coming this way! Kyle jumped to his feet, finally free from his 5-minute silence. What are you talking about? Trevor's eyes were wild, his breath coming in short gasps. I don't know. It looked like a woman, but her eyes were all black. Amber stood up, clutching the deck of cards tightly. You're lying. I'm not lying, Trevor yelled. It's the witch. She's coming for us. Lizzie's mind raced, her fear growing with every second. The rules. They had broken the rules. The game wasn't supposed to stop until all the cards were drawn, and now... Suddenly, the fire flickered, casting long shadows across the clearing. The temperature seemed to drop instantly, and a thick fog began to roll in from the woods surrounding them. We have to keep playing, Amber said, her voice shaking now. If we finish the game, maybe. Before she could finish, there was a rustling sound from the trees. The group froze, their eyes locked on the dark forest beyond. And then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward. She was tall, her face obscured by the hood of a long, tattered cloak. But her eyes, they were completely black, just as Trevor had described. And as she stepped closer, the firelight caught her face, revealing a twisted, grotesque grin. Amber dropped the cards, her voice barely a whisper. "The witch?" Without warning, the figure lunged toward them, her long, claw-like fingers reaching out. The group scattered, each running in a different direction, their screams echoing through the night. But Lizzie didn't run. She stood frozen in place, her eyes locked on the witch's black gaze. A voice echoed in her mind, her own voice, repeating the rules of the game. Finish the game, or face the consequences. As the witch drew nearer, Lizzie knew there was no escape. My name is Daniel Morgan, and I grew up in a small town in Tennessee, not far from the Mississippi River. There was always something mysterious about the old graveyard near the riverbanks, a place known as Haven Hill Cemetery. Most of the locals kept their distance from it, especially after sunset. Strange occurrences had been whispered about for decades, from eerie lights floating through the trees to soft whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Haven Hill wasn't just any graveyard. It was old, dating back to the Civil War. Many of the graves were overgrown with vines and moss, their headstones worn smooth by time. Some claimed that the restless spirits of soldiers and townsfolk haunted the place, seeking peace they never found in life. As a kid, I heard the stories, but I never believed them, at least not until the night my friends and I ventured there. It was a chilly evening in late November. My friends James, Mark, and I were hanging out at Mark's place when the conversation turned to local legends. We had heard the stories about Haven Hill all our lives, but none of us had ever gone to check it out. Mark, always the adventurous one, suggested we go and see for ourselves if the place was as haunted as everyone said. At first, I wasn't sure. There was something about that cemetery that gave me the creeps, even though I didn't believe in ghosts. But James was eager to go, and before I knew it, we were heading toward Haven Hill, flashlights in hand. We reached the cemetery just as the last light of day was fading. The entrance was marked by an old, wrought iron gate, half covered in rust. Beyond it, the headstones stretched out in neat rows, disappearing into the darkness under the looming trees. A thick fog had begun to roll in from the river, making the place look even more eerie. We stepped through the gate, the only sounds the crunch of leaves beneath our feet and the distant call of an owl. For a while, it was just like any other cemetery, silent, still, and a little unsettling. But as we wandered deeper into the graveyard, things started to change. It began with a whisper. At first, I thought I was imagining it. A faint voice, too soft to make out the words, carried on the wind. I stopped in my tracks, shining my flashlight around, but there was no one there. Just rows of headstones and the twisting branches of the trees above. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. James nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, I heard it." Mark, always the skeptic, shrugged it off. "It's just the wind," he said, though he didn't sound as confident as usual. We kept walking, but the whispers grew louder. It was as if dozens of voices were murmuring just out of earshot, their words indistinct but filled with a sense of urgency. My heart began to race, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow moving among the graves. It was quick, barely visible, but I knew it wasn't a trick of the light. I wasn't the only one who saw it either. "Did you see that?" James asked, his voice shaking. I nodded, trying to steady my breath. "Yeah, something's out there." We kept moving, our flashlights flickering as we went. The air grew colder, and the fog thickened, swirling around us like it was alive. The whispers continued, growing louder with every step. They weren't just voices anymore. They sounded like they were speaking directly to us, urging us to leave. Suddenly, Mark stopped. "We need to get out of here," he said, his bravado gone. We turned to head back toward the entrance, but that's when we heard it, a soft, rustling sound behind us, like footsteps. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing there, just shadows and fog. Then, out of the darkness, a figure appeared. It was a man, or at least it looked like one at first. He was tall and thin, his clothes tattered and dirty. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes... There was something wrong with his eyes. They were dark, hollow, as if they had seen things no living person should ever see. He didn't move, just stood there, watching us. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they were trying to warn us. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel my legs trembling. "Who are you?" Mark called out, his voice wavering. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it slowly raised its hand, pointing toward the river. I didn't want to look, but something compelled me to turn. In the distance, through the fog, I could see the faint glow of lanterns, bobbing up and down as if carried by invisible hands. My blood ran cold. Those lights weren't there before. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. Without a word, we turned and ran, sprinting back toward the entrance as fast as we could. The whispers followed us, growing louder, more insistent. I could hear footsteps behind us, closing in, but I didn't dare look back. By the time we reached the gate, I was gasping for breath. We didn't stop running until we were back on the main road, far from the cemetery. Only then did we slow down, our hearts pounding in our chests. For a long time, none of us spoke. Finally, James broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't have an answer. None of us did. All I knew was that someone was in that graveyard, and whatever it was, it didn't want us there. I haven't been back to Haven Hill Cemetery since that night, and I don't plan to. But sometimes when I drive past it, I can't help but glance toward the hill where the graves lie hidden beneath the trees. And every now and then, in the distance, I swear I see those lanterns glowing in the fog, just like they did that night. I don't know what we encountered in that cemetery, whether it was a ghost, a spirit, or something else entirely. But I do know this. Haven Hill isn't just a place for the dead to rest. It's a place where something still lingers, something that watches and waits in the shadows. My name is Sarah Thompson, and I work at a small bank in a quiet town in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knows each other and gossip travels faster than the wind. One afternoon, while working the counter, I encountered something that still sends chills down my spine. It was just after lunch, and the bank was unusually quiet. Most of the customers had come in early to handle their transactions and grab lunch from the nearby cafe. I was organizing some paperwork when I noticed a woman walking toward the bathroom in the back of the bank. She had long, dark hair and wore a long gray coat that seemed a bit out of place for the season. I figured she was just another customer, but something about her felt off. After a few minutes, I noticed she hadn't returned. I shrugged it off at first, but as time passed, I felt a sense of unease creeping in. It wasn't like her to take so long. I decided to check on her, thinking she might need assistance. When I reached the bathroom door, I knocked lightly. "Ma'am, are you all right in there?" I called out, but there was no response. My instincts kicked in, and I turned the doorknob. To my surprise, it swung open easily. I stepped inside, but the bathroom was empty. The air felt heavy, and a chill ran down my spine. I glanced around, thinking she must have left through another exit, but that didn't explain why the room felt so eerie. As I was about to leave, I noticed something lying on the floor, a small leather passbook. I picked it up, thinking it might belong to the woman. It was worn and old, with yellowed pages and faded writing. Flipping through it, I saw entries dating back many years, mostly transactions of small amounts. The last entry caught my attention. It was dated just a few days prior and mentioned a large withdrawal. Curiosity piqued, I tucked the passbook under my arm and went back to my desk. I was determined to find out who it belonged to. After a few minutes of searching the bank's records, I found the name written in the passbook. Margaret Hill. Margaret was a name I recognized. She had been a longtime customer, a sweet old lady who always came in with a warm smile. But the last transaction in the passbook didn't match her usual patterns. I felt a sense of concern wash over me. Suddenly, the bank door swung open and a gust of wind blew in, making the lights flicker momentarily. I looked up to see an elderly woman standing in the doorway, looking frail but determined. Her eyes widened when she saw me. "Margaret?" I called out, holding up the passbook. The woman's expression changed, a mix of recognition and fear crossing her face. "Where did you find that?" she asked, stepping closer. I explained how I discovered the passbook in the bathroom and asked if she was all right. Her gaze darted nervously around the bank as if she were searching for something. I I thought I lost it, she stammered. It's very important to me. I handed it to her, but she hesitated before taking it. Can I ask what happened? You seem to take a long time in the bathroom, I probed gently. Margaret glanced over her shoulder, her voice dropping to a whisper. I saw her, the woman in the bathroom. My heart raced. What do you mean? What woman? She's been following me for weeks now, Margaret replied, her voice trembling. Every time I go to the bank, I feel her presence. In the bathroom, I saw her reflection in the mirror. She was staring right at me. A chill ran down my spine. Are you sure it wasn't just your imagination? Margaret shook her head vigorously. No, it's real. She wants something from me, something that belongs to her. I tried to calm her down, but I could feel the tension in the air. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, and I thought I saw a shadow dart past the entrance of the bank. Margaret, you need to leave. Maybe take a break from coming here for a while, I suggested, hoping to ease her fear. But she just looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of terror and sadness. I can't, she whispered. I have to settle my account. It's all I have left. Before I could say anything else, she turned and rushed out of the bank, clutching the passbook tightly to her chest. I watched her go, a feeling of dread settling in my stomach. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease as I finished my shift. When I finally left the bank, I glanced back at the building, half expecting to see Margaret again. But the only thing that greeted me was the silence of the night. Weeks passed, and I didn't see Margaret again. I learned from my coworkers that she hadn't come in since that day. It wasn't until one fateful evening that I discovered why. The news spread quickly throughout the town, a tragic story of an elderly woman who had passed away alone in her home. When I heard the news, my heart sank. I remembered the fear in her eyes, the urgency in her voice. It all made sense now. But there was something else that nagged at me. The very next day, while cleaning up the back office, I found the passbook lying on my desk. It hadn't been there before. With trembling hands, I opened it to the last entry. It was different now. The numbers had changed, and beside the last transaction, I noticed a new date, the day Margaret passed away. I felt a chill sweep over me, and as I stared at the page, I couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret's presence lingered, still searching for something that belonged to her, even in death. To this day, I can't explain what happened that afternoon in the bank, but I learned that sometimes the past doesn't let go so easily, and some spirits refuse to be forgotten. My name is Ethan Carter, and I've lived in Colton, a small town in the Midwest, for most of my life. The town itself is quiet, the kind of place where nothing ever really happens. But there's one spot that locals avoid, the abandoned train depot on the outskirts of town. It used to be the hub of activity in the 1920s, but after the railway shut down, it was left to rot. Now it's just a crumbling old building, barely standing against the elements. I first heard the stories about the depot when I was a kid. They say it's haunted by the ghost of a station master who died in a freak accident back in the day. People who wander too close claim to hear strange noises, whispers, footsteps, even the sound of a train that never arrives. Some say they've seen a figure in an old-fashioned uniform walking the platform, only to vanish into thin air. I never believed any of it, of course. I thought it was just an old wives' tale, something to keep kids from exploring a dangerous abandoned building. But that all changed one summer night when I experienced the terror firsthand. It was a warm evening, and a few friends and I were hanging out at the local diner. We'd heard the ghost stories a million times, but something about that night made us curious. One of my friends, Jake, dared us to check out the depot. We were bored, so we agreed. It was just a stupid challenge. What could go wrong? We arrived at the depot just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The place looked even creepier in the fading light. The roof was sagging and the windows were boarded up. Vines crawled up the sides of the building, as if nature itself was trying to swallow it whole. Still want to do this? Jake asked, flashing a nervous grin. No one wanted to back out, so we crept inside. The interior was even worse than I expected. Old wooden benches were covered in dust, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. The The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards under our feet. We split up, each of us exploring a different part of the depot. I found myself wandering down a narrow hallway that led to what looked like the station master's office. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, a cold breeze hit me, sending a shiver down my spine. The office was small and cluttered with old papers and ledgers scattered across a desk. A faded calendar hung on the wall, stuck in the year 1932. Just as I was about to leave, I heard something, a faint tapping sound. It was rhythmic, like someone tapping their fingers on the desk. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I strained to listen, but the tapping stopped. I mustered the courage to call out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" No answer. That's when I saw it. A shadow moving across the far wall, like someone standing just outside the door. I whipped around, but no one was there. My mind raced. Was it my friends playing a trick on me? I quickly exited the office, only to find the hallway empty. I rushed back to the main waiting area, where I found Jake and the others. They hadn't seen or heard anything, but the uneasy look in their eyes told me they were just as freaked out as I was. We decided to leave before things got any weirder. As we made our way out, something happened that I'll never forget. We were about to step through the exit when we heard it, a distant whistle, like a train approaching. But there were no tracks, no train, just an eerie echoing whistle that sent chills through us. We froze, glancing at each other in disbelief. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the faint rumble of wheels on rails. Panic set in, and we bolted out of the depot, running as fast as we could. That night, none of us spoke about what we'd heard. We just silently agreed to never go back to that place. But the story doesn't end there. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brought something back with me. Strange things started happening at home, objects moving on their own, doors opening and closing by themselves, and every night, just as I was about to fall asleep, I'd hear that same tapping sound, faint but unmistakable. I haven't been back to the depot since, and I don't plan to, but sometimes when I'm alone at night, I swear I can hear the distant whistle of a phantom train calling me back. Maybe it's just a coincidence, or maybe that old station master never really left, forever waiting for a train that will never come.